This is the Premature Menocast with
Kate,
Nikki,
Siobhan,
and Nina.
We're four friends who have met through the life-changing diagnosis of premature ovarian insufficiency. This podcast aims to raise awareness of the diagnosis and inspire you to take action to feel better.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Premature Menocast. We've got an incredible episode for you today, and we are welcoming Naomi, who is herself someone who has lived experience of POI. Naomi's currently working in international development, but she's here today with us as an advocate for women from South Asia and Pakistan, and also women who may be coming from a marginalised area of society. She's going to talk to us about her lived experience, and we're also going to have some maybe more hard-hitting questions and open up some of those barriers that face women who are coming from different backgrounds as well. So Naomi, thank you for joining us today. We've also got Kate and Nina with us. So hello, ladies.
Hello, lovely to be back.
But Naomi, why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your own journey?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Not done one of these before. So it's quite interesting. It's quite a learning experience. So I was diagnosed at 36, hadn't the foggiest clue what POI was when I was told about it. And I was told what it is, POF, premature ovarian failure. And I thus began the learning curve, which is a steep one, isn't it, with POI? And I think through the lived experience of HRT both not working for me and working for me, and the deep dive I've done into understanding what's going to work for me, what the various combos are, etc. It's taught me a lot about how undercredited hormones are for our body. And that feeds into POI, obviously, also natural age menopause, and also other gynecological conditions that have, endocrine influences, so the sort of hormone system in the body. And as I progressed into that and understanding more about the impacts on brain, bone, and heart health, it sort of lit up my imagination and my curiosity about women's health, access, understanding, knowledge of it, the whole women aren't small men, etc. And as I've kind of gone into that and I've learned more about, the marketing of the commercialization of menopause, and obviously POI often gets nestled under menopause for the sake of simplicity sometimes, though we know they're separate. And I suppose I'm half British, half Pakistani, so I have a parent from each. I joke and say I'm half white, half brown. I also spent a lot of time growing up in Karachi in Pakistan and seeing my mum and aunt go through various forms of gynecological cancer, so uterine and breast, and other people that I've slowly, as I've learned more about the symptoms, looked back and gone, gosh, they had a hard time of it. And they didn't know it. There's a sort of silent struggle behind it or with it. And it's just realizing how much more there is to be done in that space. But in countries like Pakistan, I mean, even the UK, so many countries where clinicians are knowledgeable about POI, clinicians are not knowledgeable as much as they could be about menopause, and the misinformation out there. And I think bit by bit, I felt I want to speak up about POI, and that's how the Instagram handle Speak Up for POI was born, because I thought I want, like, visualizing a megaphone. I want to speak up about this. I want to spread the knowledge on hormone health and women and men. And then I put out this article, made the page and the Instagram handle, sorry. And then and that's been a learning curve in itself. Then put out this article. I knew someone at a journalist, and I asked them if I could put a write-up, do a write-up towards beginning to shed light on the issue. And that's where the article came from. And what I tried to do with that was sort of use it as a gateway, almost like put all the foundational information in there. And I've talked about both POI and menopause in there, because I think one of the issues is that people will refer to it as, say, premature menopause or early menopause, and research studies as well. So I've spoken to so many women who, at 30, for instance, went through gynecological surgery, ovohysterectomies, and there are people who get missed out of the POI because they're told it's menopause or it's not, and sort of left to fend for themselves. So I think that's why I included both, to also emphasize the undercredited hormones and how it all works, and what HRT is included or available in Pakistan. I think one of the biggest things I found actually was that where there's very few countries that actually have good access to transdermal options for estrogen, for HRT. Many countries will have just oral, or the IUS contraception, because of course, birth control, family planning, and all of that.
That's a really good point, Naomi. I was just thinking of a patient I saw recently in a very similar situation, and we were discussing HRT availability, and it's actually surprising. We always think, oh, it must be the same as what we get here in the UK, but actually, where this patient was located, you get exactly as you say, sourcing transdermal HRT was actually a real difficulty.
Yeah. I actually want to do a whole write-up on interviewing farmers in countries like Pakistan to find out, because I've done some digging, and the why there isn't availability or barely much availability of things like vaginal estrogen. And I've had women ask me, what do I do about this? And I'm thinking, I don't know what to say to you, because there aren't alternative options to this, really, to my knowledge, in those countries, in places like Pakistan. And oddly enough, India does have transdermal options, not patches, but they have the gel, and they have vaginal estrogen. So that's a bordering country. So it's just really, really kind of gone the whole, but why?
Yeah.
And that's driven a lot of my interest, the whole, but why?
Yeah. And Naomi, when you were diagnosed, how old were you? And were you diagnosed in Pakistan, or were you diagnosed when you were living in the UK?
Interesting story there. So I was diagnosed at 36, the whole classic. I'm 39 now. And at 36 was the whole classic game of contraception to try and conceive. Periods didn't come. And I had been missing chunks of periods before that. And I kept going back to the doctor saying, I'm tired, I'm anxious, all these other symptoms, some GSM symptoms, so genitourinary symptoms of menopause, your bladder, vaginal, all of that stuff. And they would do a whole panel, they would do thyroid, this, that, and the other, but none of them did hormone testing or FSH, LH, and they kept putting it down to my Nexplanon implant in my arm, the subdermal contraceptive implant, and which is progesterone based. And I kept saying, yeah, but this is my fourth one, and the first two I did not miss so many periods, and these next two it's changed. So what's going on there? And eventually, I can see from some of my doctor's notes that one of them talked about could remove the implant to see if periods return. But I don't know what happened there. You know how it often is you see some communication and you look back at it and go, oh, but why didn't they? And I had a very competent GP otherwise, who didn't think to look at this, but everything else I had pelvic ultrasounds, I had bloods done, but not the FSH, not the LH, not the estrogen. I suspect that it started for me definitely from 29, 30, possibly as early as 18, 20 years old, because of looking back at the symptoms. Funnily enough, I was on a trip to visiting Karachi. I can't remember what year it was. I must have been, was it like early 30s or something like that? And I, with a friend, decided to just get some fertility testing done just to see where I was at, and spoke to a gynecologist over there who said, have these tests done, including AMH. That was my very first indication. In fact, it's the clinician in the article that I've written up who's one of the reviewers. And my AMH came up as something like 0.028 or 6 or 3 or something like that. And she said to me, please follow up and get your FSH and your LH done. Now, at the time, there was in my family, my close family, there was someone going through serious health issues, and I just didn't have the headspace to do that. I just went, you know what, I don't want to know more just yet. And I wish it had been pushed. I wish it had been asked more about, and kind of going, well, this is why I want to check, because you might have blah, blah, blah. Anyway, fast forward to 36, that's when I got diagnosed.
I just want to remind you back a couple of steps that I'm really interested to kind of pull on a thread, and that is the availability of different types of hormone replacement therapy for women. And do you think it is down to a lack of understanding of what the different options can bring, and that there is no one size fits all for any woman in preparation of HRT? Is it down to no research? Like I just touching on that, most of the research was done on small men, mostly, white small men as well. That's the fact. Yeah, so I wondered whether in your thoughts around, you said you would like to interview some pharmaceutical companies or at least do some research around that. Have you given that some thought? Is there anything like your opinion on that, about why there aren't many options?
So I have absolutely sort of thought about this and spoken to a couple of doctors about it in Pakistan, and the opinion that I have formed, because I don't have any sort of research or quotations or anything to back up on this. Oh, can you hear that feedback, or is it just me? Okay. I'll just repeat that. I haven't done any sort of formal interviews or anything like that for this, but my opinion from just informal conversations with clinicians in Pakistan, and just Googling things and participating in webinars and stuff like that, and just the research around it is, and it ties in with the whole NIH numbers as well, the National Institute of Health numbers, where the focus is on gynecological cancers and on fertility. And that's where the money is for I suppose for farmers, maybe, to be pumping funds into that. And I think with what was I going to say about that? Pumping funds into I completely lost my train of thought. I think that's part of the issue, is that the focus is more on those. It hasn't been on menopause, on POI and things. I mean, even within places like the UK, the shortages that we experience. And I think that's partly driven by, you'll often come across there's more women demanding, or after the NIH study that we all know was not a very strong study and led to the whole scare around breast cancer and HRT and cardiovascular disease. I won't go into that, but we all know it's a flawed study. How HRT options dropped, or the shortages, that the amount that was made was dropped because women weren't demanding, it wasn't being prescribed by clinicians, not being asked by women. And I think in that same way, because when there isn't a demand for it by clinicians or by a demographic that needs it, then that whole demand supply chain kind of breaks down. You don't have demand, you don't have supply. So I think that's one of the things. I think it's the focus on fertility and on cancer treatments. So the treatments that are, and family planning, so contraception. So I think the treatments or the HRT that is available is drawn from those three areas rather than for HRT purposes.
It sounds like a lot of it's around misunderstandings as well, like we talked about with the that study.
Yeah.
And I suppose generally, how do you think POI is typically understood or misunderstood within South Asian cultural contexts in particular?
It'll usually be discovered because usually something like after marriage, after a woman getting married and, beginning the fertility journey and having fertility issues. And that's often when it's discovered. I mean, just like it was with me, but I've been married a very long time by that point. I think that's often when it's discovered. Also, if someone is got like absent puberty, or if they are going and saying a very clear marker like, I am missing periods, I don't have periods, rather than things like I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling heat, or I'm feeling, those kinds of symptoms, rather than just the absence of periods. So I think those are the kinds of things that it gets picked up with. And I'd say most frequently with the after being married, having fertility issues. And and obviously globally, women tend to be associated societally with reproductive abilities, with being able to have kids. And in some cultures, that messaging is stronger than in others.
Do you think that Do you think that there's kind of, you talked about some kind of times where people get this diagnosis, like puberty, when they're getting missed periods, or fertility struggles? Do you think there's any kind of cultural beliefs or anything that shape how people talk about those things then? Do you think people are scared to maybe open up about certain things because of almost bigger issues within a culture or bigger pressures within society? So do you think maybe teenagers are scared or don't have the language to open up about some of these things?
I think certainly that I've come across social media pages where girls talk about, when their periods begin and how scared they were. They had no idea what was going on. They thought they were dying. They thought bleeding to death or whatever. And that's, I think, across the globe. It's not, it kind of depends on how much information they get from their parents. Sex ed at school is where it is and it isn't. The school I went to, for instance, I was lucky that my parents spoke to me about it. And but many others aren't. And I learned a lot more from having studied GCSE biology. But sex ed wasn't a thing at school. I don't know I didn't go to school in the UK, so I don't know. I know that sex ed is included, but I don't know what the syllabus looks like. In terms of things like periods, it is spoken about in hushed voices. I think health-seeking behaviors can be quite different in different demographics. So let's take a country like Pakistan, for instance, where or South Asia in general, where you'll have a range of socioeconomic brackets. You'll have a range in terms of income, in terms of education, in terms of where they're living, etc., healthcare access, health-seeking behaviors. Sorry, this is me speaking health-seeking behaviors is because I work in public health. So I'm using that language, which means their inclination to go and see a doctor when they have an issue. And in fact, the research that I was doing on South Asia, and we have some of the highest rates of POI in South Asia, also, I believe, in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think the reasons behind it are not wanting to, either it'll be geographical distances from a hospital, or it'll be the money required to see a doctor because health systems aren't all free. It'll be knowledge, and it'll be the list of priorities that they might go to the hospital for. Unless someone's really ill, they might not. And that's partly because of money and partly knowledge. And there's also a reliance on your local healer, etc., and things like that. And also maybe just keeping quiet about it, particularly if a woman is, if in a more sort of conservative demographic, it might not be highlighted that there are any health issues because it might affect her chances of getting married, of someone being interested in marrying her. And in a culture where a woman's whole life is about getting married and having children, that can be a whole other level of devastating. Because, I mean, people like myself or many others who have other identities, it's not only our family, it's not only husband and children or partner and children, it's careers, I think that identity shift becomes a little bit easier than for someone whose entire focus, their whole world comes crumbling before them. If they're told, well, you can't have kids. And if they're married, then, the pressures they're going to face then. If they're not married, a slightly different set of pressures. It's very difficult to paint any one country with one brush because you're going to have different socioeconomic brackets within them. And some of the data coming out is around, for the high rates, are the poor health-seeking behaviors. Things like viruses, diseases, STIs, malnutrition is another big one. Also, I noticed some research around endocrine disorders related to, say, agricultural workers and pesticides, chemicals, the stuff around that. Then obviously you have genetic. You'll have things like, say, a woman has had, unsafe childbirth, and she's had to undergo a hysterectomy, not necessarily an ovary hysterectomy. I understand that there's an attempt to keep the ovaries to what's the word?
You've got oophorectomies when you remove the ovaries, and then you can
save the ovaries. I don't know if that's the word. Save the ovaries.
Like conserve. They often say conserve the
ovaries.
Conserve.
Thank you. Conserve the ovaries. I knew that was a word. Conserve the ovaries and remove the uterus. But we also know that can have an effect on POI in terms of is it the blood flow or something like that? Because there was admittedly a time that I looked into hysterectomy because I'm severely progesterone intolerant. And I reached a point where I was like, do I just get my uterus out? And as I read into it, I was like, oh, maybe not, because there's a chance it makes things worse. So these are some of the reasons why the rates are so high. So you've got populations where they may not want to be able to spend money on health. They may not have access. They may not have clinicians who know what they're looking at. And ultimately, they're going to be looking at more life-threatening conditions.
Yeah.
In my day job, there's a lot of focus around infectious and non-infectious diseases and stuff that is likely going to, well, in terms of infectious, obviously, we could get a person quite quickly, but in terms of non-infectious or non-communicable diseases, so your hypertension, your blood pressure, your heart disease, your diabetes, asthma, epilepsy, a few other things. There are mass screening campaigns and lots of awareness campaigns at the community level to get people to come to the hospital, to screen people, to reduce mortality, reduce the death rate from those kinds of illnesses or diseases. And women's health across the globe tends to be low on the list unless it's fertility focused or cancer focused.
Well, I think you've covered so many barriers there that women in health might face, and I think what's interesting is a lot of them we do share here, and there's a lot of things that actually, like you said, just are across the globe. But then there's things that maybe when people are accessing healthcare in the UK, we don't really consider, like finance. There's private healthcare system, and sometimes you can get diagnoses quicker, but ultimately we all have access to healthcare here, and it's not really finance driven. And also the UK is a very small country compared to other places. So wherever you live, you are nearish enough healthcare facility where you can kind of seek healthcare advice. And some of those barriers are things that maybe we just don't even consider. And the stigma, the stigma is definitely still here, and there's some societal expectation, I think, in the UK that you get married, you have kids, this is your family. But I think maybe the pressures for some people are not there as much as maybe in some of the populations you've just described.
Yeah, and I mean, sorry, who was? Oh,
and that's Kate.
Go ahead, Kate.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting that you've touched on about education at schools, and it wasn't until 2019, following the Menopause Matter campaign in the UK, that they added menopause education in schools. But we often think, oh, tick, we've done it. And the campaign led by Diane Danziman did a fantastic job. But when we look today. When we look further down the line, my question is, it's great that the government said, yeah, we're going to add menopause education, but I can't help thinking, what does that look like in schools? Because who's teaching it? And if they are teaching it, are they just covering menopause at the expected age? Are they covering other types of menopause like POI or surgical or medical menopause? I can't speak day to day. I just wonder what it looks like in schools and who's teaching it. And as you say, that's just the UK. As you say, thinking about other countries across the board, it could be very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go on.
Even in the UK, I went to a Catholic school, so we did not have sex education. We had one session on periods where we got given, it was really awkward. I can't even remember if it was delivered by a man or a woman, and we got like this goodie bag of like period packs that the boys were then stealing of us and throwing around the playground afterwards. So it's like that disrespect of like, do you know what I mean? There's this common, like, it's not a serious thing, it's not a big issue, and it was one session that was done. So it's, school education isn't always delivered maybe by the correct people or in the right way.
And just a thought comes to mind while you were speaking is, when you are low in estrogen, when you don't have the right levels of hormones in your body, you don't always have the drive or motivation to do something about it. Like, it's literally, it comes down to not feeling so much sort of depression, anxiety, despair, whatever. It really flavors how you access help for yourself, how you kind of think about yourself as, I'm not living like this is ridiculous, versus giving into it. And I don't mean giving into it in terms of willpower. Literally, I mean, as a marker of how low hormones affect us, and using it as a marker of, I think I need to increase my estrogen dose or whatever it is. It's not having the drive and the motivation to get yourself help. It can be really, really difficult. You have to really be have a support system around you. And a lot of the women that I have spoken to, maybe their parents know, maybe their siblings know, their wider family may not know. It's not something that they're speaking openly about. It carries shame, it carries stigma, it carries being frightened for their future. It carries themes like that. And I sort of did a crowdsource some opinions around this. And yeah, it was this sense that we all do of feeling worthless, of feeling, what's your purpose in life, of even things like career progression and stuff. I myself was off work for a solid 6 months. And I've only, over the span of about a year and a half, been able to increase to 3 and then 4 days. And now I'm fine. I mean, the putting the article out there and creating that page is testament to HRT getting me to that point where I can feel my intellectual curiosity have come back. I can feel the ability, the clarity in my mind to be able to write, to be able to think, to be able to be on this podcast today. And that wasn't me a year ago. That wasn't me 2 years ago, when I had really sort of become a shell of myself. And honestly, thank God for modern medicine and having access to these drugs to restore health in the way it does. And I think a lot of women, my feeling about it is you don't realize how good you can feel until you start feeling it. So with, as you increase, you're like, well, I'm not having these symptoms. I'm okay. And then you increase it and you're like, oh my God, I didn't know I could feel better. And obviously you can go the other end of extreme where you go too high and then you feel awful again. And that needs to careful management. But
yeah, sorry, carry on.
There's just some background feedback, I think, there, right? Yeah, Nina's. So where was I? I was talking about, someone remind me, please.
So you were just saying you're not sure, sometimes you don't realize how good you can feel until you feel it. And I think we don't realize how much of a difference HRT can have until you've taken that HRT.
Yeah, just as an example, driving on the motorway, I found it terrifying. And when I added in both better levels of estrogen, but also testosterone, and obviously not everyone needs testosterone. It has lots of benefits anecdotally and those studied. But that I can now drive fairly freely on the motorway. And I can usually tell I'm having a fluctuation because suddenly I find myself feeling scared on the motorway. And for listeners, wherever you're speaking, motorway means speeds of, is it kilometers per hour? 70 kilometers per hour, which can feel really, really fast and quite scary. And, you're sitting in the tin can around these speeding cars. And it's so weird. One of the things I noticed with estrogen, for instance, was depth perception, like spatial awareness. And in my sort of severe anxiety that I was experiencing before estrogen got to the right point, I was like, did I walk past that? How close was I past that? Did I do this? Did I, like, the spatial awareness was so weird. And that's something that has now largely gone. And yeah, I think, when you're feeling so desperate to get better and you will try anything. And I think that's one of the reasons for putting that article out also, was to say, these are good sources of information. There's so much misinformation out there. It is so unethically, the companies that so unethically market their products. It really enrages a lot of us, I think, where we can see that there's no evidence, that there's no studies behind it, that there's, and this is again having the cognitive capacity to think, to look behind the marketing of something and say, just because that says menopause on it, it's not necessarily going to help you. Wasn't it one? There was a quote somewhere of a woman saying, "I would have taken arsenic if you told me it would help."
But I think you get so desperate, don't you? And like you were talking about as well, you're saying that days you don't have the energy to get up and you just don't have the energy to face anything.
I was absolutely there. Yeah.
And that might be with a diagnosis, but you forget you might have a diagnosis, but then you might have other things going on. You might have issues in your relationship. You might have issues going on with your family, and you're trying to juggle all of these things, and it just gets too much.
I mean, I completely shut down for a while, about 2 weeks after going cold turkey off HRT. No one ever do that, please. That was a dumb decision on my part because I was feeling so badly unwell on progesterone, on oral, tried vaginally to eutrogestin. So I'm on that the percent of the population that doesn't cope well with it. And estrogen going way too high, it got mismanaged initially. And I went cold turkey off it. And 2 weeks later, I could not get out of bed. And I signed off sick from work. And it took me several months before I decided to seek help again, because it took me that long, I think, for my nervous system to, I don't know, reorient itself, recalibrate itself or something. I don't know exactly what, but there were certainly points I'm like, I cannot keep going on like this. Something has to change. And I did get preyed upon a little bit by different marketing. I did go private because I didn't feel I had this enough support. And it was a very, very helpless feeling of kind of, where do I go from this, and reaching out to whomever I could. And I've spent a fair bit of money that I'm still paying off trying to, those funds. I've now just got back into the NHS.
I think Nina was talking the other day about that kind of helplessness and motivation. Nina, what were you saying? We were having a conversation about today.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, I'm just kind of interested to know from you, like you mentioned there that you signed off sick from work, and then you were feeling helpless, and that, you've had no motivation yourself, and no doubt there are so many people listening to this and on this podcast that have felt the same. And so I'm wondering, how do you think women in the community are perceived when they're in this situation, considering that this is a very seldom talked about subject, in terms of even your periods are seldom talked about, let alone anything else to do with reproductive health? And does it lead, do you think, to, you've just touched upon that lightly, about women seeking help elsewhere and then lead into misinformation and like self-treatment and not seeking help? And so I suppose, there's that feeling of helplessness and how it's perceived. And so that would make some women just go in the other direction of seeking help entirely, which, it's kind of like that, the less you do, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the less you do kind of will. Yeah, so what's your thoughts on that, on the perception of women that just come across as completely unmotivated, and does it lead to them seeking help elsewhere and not really getting the right help?
I think this is such an interesting question. Because I'm also thinking about women who have been wrongly institutionalized, because their mental health becomes so badly poor, so badly affected, that their family put them in, they think that they need to go into psychiatric institution because, and even at that point, hormones are necessarily checked. And I know there are some doctors like Newson Clinic and others who have looked into this. And I know of people who have been through that, and I look back and I think, gosh, was that actually really severe menopause? Was that actually really severe hormonal fluctuations that put them in that position? And if that had been looked at, would they not have had to go through that? And I can't imagine how frightening that must be. If you just think about not even severe forms of hormonal, like the impact that hormone decline can have on a person. And I'd say a person because testosterone in men can also be really, really detrimental to their sense of well-being, etc. And with it, not having that information, not knowing the signs to look out for, whether it's POI, whether it's menopause, or really anything else, I think it's such a sort of scary thing. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Sorry. I was saying that even with less severe forms, where I don't know if any of you have experienced it, but I know other women, myself as well, who experience that horrible sense of dread that washes over one, where you just feel like, good God, something awful is about to happen. And you think, what the hell just happened? Like, why did I feel like that? Multiply that by 100 probably every day, and being in that constant state of not being functional, of not being yourself, is terrifying. And this is why I talk about the undercredited nature of hormones. And I have friends who I can see are now going through, because they've caught up with me and are now going through perimenopause. And I can see how one of my friends I was talking to was saying how, just a few years ago, she had a slightly different drive to, and she's like, in terms of her career and managing kids and stuff. And now she's thinking, well, do I still want to do that? And I said, it's so interesting that you're talking like this, because I think this is the beginnings of the rewiring of the brain, the sort of reprioritization activities, the change of type of energy that you have It's not necessarily lower energy always, but it's a type of energy. I just intuitively feel like that these very subtle boiling frog syndrome implies that it's always a problem. It's not always a problem. I know we're talking about women who do experience hormone decline as a severe issue. And I know that's the whole, medicalization of menopause stuff. But I'm going to go off on a tangent there. If I, please bring me back to the point, actually.
Well, I suppose it's talking about that kind of thinking about reprioritizing things. But I mean, I always wonder this as well. I wonder whether it's partly the rewiring of the brain, but I do sometimes wonder when you've hit rock bottom with anything in life, or when you've been through the worst that can happen, do you then just have a bit of a different perspective on things? And then maybe before it was like, God, I need to get to the top of my career and that's it. And then you kind of assume that everything else will just come. And then when suddenly all of that's whipped from under you, is it just that you look at life with a different perspective and maybe what actually is important? I don't know. It's I suppose you could.
I think one of the lessons I've learned in life is you have no idea. You can't predict how your priorities are going to change based on what happens in life. And I remember being really surprised by 6 months before I had been bumming around the world, visiting, working in for work, places like Senegal, Mali, etc. And 6 months later, and I was like ready to go, oh, this is really exciting, getting to see all these places. And then 6 months later, I didn't want to leave my sofa. This is pre-diagnosis. This is before I was diagnosed. And I had a couple of burnouts, and that was one of them. And now I realize what it was. I kept describing it as burnout, as my car battery going, phone battery dying. But it was POI. So this is the whole 2930 and a host of other symptoms that I now put together. And I think that was really sort of startling to me. Someone who loved traveling all over the world, meeting new people everywhere, suddenly didn't want to leave her sofa or home. And I've been through that again, but with the knowledge of POI, the knowledge of HRT. And I remember as I climbed on testosterone slowly, I signed up to a running club and I started running. It then hurt my back. That's a different story. And I stopped, but I've been trying to sort of get my mojo back to get back into running or exercise and things. And I can feel it subtly building. But that's the thing. It's subtle. It can be so subtle for many women, other than maybe, I don't know, surgical menopause, where suddenly your hormones are removed overnight. But I think that's the issue. Is it so subtle you don't even necessarily realize yourself, let alone know to go to a clinician.
Yeah.
And yes, in terms of, I think, women across the globe and South Asia too, elsewhere, it is.
I mean, have you spoken to? We were talking about kind of like the subtleness of this, and also when you said that you know women who kind of have maybe confided in people close to them in their close circle. But do you know of anyone who's kind of been misdiagnosed or just simply dismissed by kind of healthcare professionals due to this kind of maybe systematic bias or lack of resources?
I mean, I'm one of them who was missed for years, who kept going back to the doctor to say, what's up with me? I was in a physical job. I was, walking a lot. And so it wasn't like, oh, you're not exercising enough. You're not the usual exercise more, eat better, lose weight. I didn't have any of those categories applied to me because I was fit. I was walking everywhere. I was outside in the sunshine, etc., eating fine. And they kept missing me. Every time I said, I'm missing chunks of periods. I've now missed 3. I've now missed 6. So I'm one of them. And we probably all know a woman in our life who has been missed for endometriosis or PCOS or whatever it is, because they can't figure it out. And they don't realize how much it's affecting them, because it's like being in a toxic relationship. You don't know. Yeah. And yeah, so I mean, if you look at like South Asian communities, for instance, yes, absolutely, there are a lot of demands in terms of childcare, aging parents, and it's a different culture in terms of the care of the elderly is still within the household, and that's the case in a lot of parts of the world. It's also here, but there's sort of the outsourcing of it a little bit differently, perhaps. And I know someone who said that their wife will effectively borrow days of energy and sort of pay the price by the next few days after that, having to really rest. And if you've got very, very traditional families where you've got maybe the woman, the husband, and living with the husband's parents, so in that sort of setting, you do have lots of situations where the woman is sort of grinning and bearing and keeping on with housework, cooking, etc. And that's really sort of where her worth is tied to, is as a housewife, the upkeep of the house, the upkeep of family, fertility, all of that. And so, yes, absolutely, they have to maintain that same energy. And if they're missing from it, if they're missing from social situations, etc., it probably would be spoken about in hushed terms as, oh, she's ill. What's happened? Why is she ill? Yeah, that kind of almost gossipy. And there will be, sort of hiding that away. And
how do you think that women stay so with the demands that you've just listed there that are put on women within South Asian culture and communities, and it sounds like there's a big expectation put on women that they are expected to maintain the same energy as you said, through each stage of their life. So they'll be raising families of service to their community, and their parents, may live with them, like you've said. There's children to raise and educate, and possibly even jobs to go to as well. How do you think that women who have been diagnosed with POI are dealing with that diagnosis, as well as trying to continue on with their life? Like most people, many people, I'd say everyone actually, who's been diagnosed with POI, how do you think those women stay motivated to do that? Like, how do they cope?
probably family pressure, probably being told, why on earth aren't you cooking, or why on earth aren't you cleaning, or whatever, and being told off, perhaps, for not.
So it's less motivation and more pressure, like almost.
Yeah.
Like
I would say there's that. And I'd also say perhaps, again, if you're feeling as crap as you are without hormones, the way someone's talking to you is going to flavor the way you're responding as well. So someone might just feel quite worthless even more so, and their self-esteem issues get hit even more, and then get into a shell even further under that pressure. It's not necessary that they're going to have that internal motivation to sort of either fight back or to speak up for themselves and so on, or even have that clarity too. They might themselves think, gosh, why aren't I? Why can't I seem to be doing X, Y, and Z, comparing themselves to their peers, to other women. We compare ourselves to our peers who don't have POI, who seem to have bags of energy. And I think it's often quite natural, because that's how maybe something's wrong, where you're going to go, well, my peers aren't going through this. Why aren't they feeling this fatigue and, all of that. So I think it's a bit of a complex one, in that you've got the mix of hormones in there. So how are you responding to that pressure? How are you responding to society's expectations of you? At the same time as feeling perhaps like you're not living up to expectations, feeling a fear of the whole people pleasing, getting things wrong. Also, there may also be a concern about, if they can't have kids, if they can't do all those things, is there any risk of ostracization? Is there any risk of being pushed out of that family unit? And I think in some very conservative communities that can happen.
So how do you think we counter that? How do we help women find that support? So if they're scared of kind of ostracization, and that because we all know POI is an isolating condition as it is, but how can we almost support, or where would you encourage women to go for support if they're feeling that? Because obviously this is devastating, this is life-changing.
So I think this comes back to my purpose for putting that article out there, is awareness raising.
Yeah. Do you think that's key with all of this?
I think that's the starting point for pretty much anything in life, whether it's anything from, that's how menstrual hygiene stuff, right? That's how that whole conversation started. I would say 10, 20 years ago, you didn't have billboards and ads and things like that up on TV and radio and things like that, where they're talking openly about period health or about menstrual products, sanitary items, not sanitary items, period products weren't spoken about openly. We're only just getting things like an updated speculum, for instance, for gynae exams. So I think it really, everything, whether it's education, the importance of education, the importance of working, the importance of eating well, hygiene, if you think about wash, sanitation, and hygiene practices across communities, and why it's important to boil water before consuming it. All of that starts with awareness raising. that these are good practices, that this is for these reasons, and then it builds from there. So then you have people who are changing their practices, who are going to the doctor. Doctors also need more awareness raising around these issues. We all know POI is not well known. And you can get lucky and have an open-minded doctor who looks into it, and you'll have those who are not and tell you off for questioning things. And so I really feel that knowledge is power. And that, again, was the drive behind the article of, hey, if you have some of these conditions, speak up for yourself. Here are the guidelines. This is how it works. Sort of, I felt like putting out just enough information to not overwhelm the audience, at the same time as enough for them to pique their interest and look into it further themselves. Have a Google, speak to, share that article. You never know what seed it plants where.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, we always talk about doctors, don't we?
Yeah. Are there any particular, so if we was to kind of give some real sage advice to women in South Asian communities who have to go and visit their GP and are expecting to be dismissed, not really expecting to get what they need from the appointment, is there anything that you would kind of say would be a good line of questioning for their GP to kind of steer the appointment? So what would you advise your peers to ask their GP when they go to the doctor? And is there any organisations as well that you could recommend to women?
Yeah. So I think that's an area I've been getting into more recently, in terms of how to advocate to your clinician, your health worker, your doctor, for yourself. I've noticed, just from the sheer amount of research I've done more recently, that my conversations with doctors have a different flavor now than they did before, because I know what to ask for. I know how to ask for it. I still don't always get it right. It's, depends on who you get, but I'm already informed enough, but without sounding like, and ultimately I'm not a doctor. So I am speaking to the doctor because they have a set of knowledge that I don't have. And so it's saying, look, what do you think of this? I've read up about this. I understand these are my options. I was thinking this might work for me because of X, Y, and Z. What do you think? So I think coming forward like that. And then I think there's recently two people. One is Dr. Lawrence Nelson, who on his community resource for premature ovarian insufficiency or primary ovarian deficiency has recently put out on his page about guidelines for how to advocate for yourself with a doctor, which I think was brilliant.
They were really good,
helpful.
weren't they?
Yeah.
For anyone who's listening who wonders who Dr. Nelson is, he's kind of a bit like the grandfather of POI. He's worked with the NIH, I think since the 80s or 90s.
Years, he said, yeah.
A long time. I'm sure there's a couple of papers I quoted in my PhD proposal from him that were like early noughties. Yeah, so he's been around a long time, and he pioneered the treatment for physiologic HRT, so using HRT to mimic a natural way of the cycle for women with POI. So yeah, he's extremely knowledgeable, and lots of support on his Facebook group. But yeah, I agree, Naomi. I thought those guidelines for potential POI patients were really, really good.
And I also really like the other post he's put out about empowering women to think differently about POI and about themselves. But again, this comes down to, you still need the HRT to be able to feel that way. And that one, and I think it was Dr. Nigat Arif possibly, who recently, or was it Dr. Farah Ahmed, I'm not sure, who recently put out something similar about how to speak to your doctor to ask for what you need. And it was, look, these are my symptoms. So the symptom diary is really important. This is how it's affecting my life. This is what I'm asking. I need help with this. What can I do to improve this? And if they're saying, no, you can't have X, Y, and Z, it's saying, okay, fine, but why? What is your reasoning? Can we document the reasoning? And that's polite, that's respectful, that's informative. It's not getting, because I understand a GP, for instance, on the NHS has 10 minutes with you, if that. And the reason I don't feel angry at doctors for having missed me is because it's not them, it's the health system set up that isn't conducive. Medical research hasn't been conducive until more recently to know that women will respond differently than men. The whole women aren't small men. And they're differently sort of handicapped by the system in caring for people. So I think that also needs changing. But I think those points were really, really useful. It's, you're entering into a care relationship for yourself with your doctor. And there may well be back and forth where they're figuring things out because they don't know everything under the planet. And yeah, I think those were really, really useful guidelines. In terms of places like South Asia, I'm not sure if there are similar guidelines like in the NHS NICE guidelines on POI. I mean, I recently spoke to someone who didn't know that there were POI NICE guidelines, a clinician.
Yeah.
Just an example.
Yeah.
So, and I kind of know they are, but they're not as good as the ESHRE ones, the ESHRE guidelines, which are like the gold standard guidelines, which were recently revised in 2024. But they are nestled under POI, but they are there. And with other countries, I was doing a sort of a nosy around of different articles on POI coming out from South Asia to kind of see what the research was. And I found maybe Iran seemed to have quite a few, interestingly enough. Pakistan had maybe 2 that I came across. There was some out of Sri Lanka. I also try to include Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, because I was trying to, different people will define the South Asian region a little bit differently, but these are the ones I focused on. And it was fascinating to see the prevalence rate across them, where less developed, trying to be, everyone will have their own definitions of whether it's low and middle income countries and high income countries, or whether it's third world country or developing country. So I'll say low and middle income countries, for the sake of this, do have higher rates of POI than high income countries. And I think the things like perhaps genetic stuff is more prevalent in some places than others. It's again going back to the whole health-seeking behaviors, the viruses, the illnesses, the stunted growth, the malnutrition, etc., that feeds into the sort of POI becomes, I suppose, a secondary issue there rather than a primary issue in terms of whether it's genetic or iatrogenic, meaning cancer-based, surgically based, or whatever. So it's an interesting question, and one I will look into around whether there are POI guidelines across in each respective South Asian country and across probably African countries as well, across the African continent.
So Naomi, because I think we are running out of time today, but I think we've talked about so many incredible things today, and we've touched on so many kind of different aspects and really looked at kind of different points of view and things. But what would be your message for women maybe in more marginalized communities or in Southeast Asian communities as well? What would your message be to them who are kind of faced with POI or who are struggling with a life facing infertility?
I think the resounding words that come to my mind is, you're not alone. I've had women reach out to me to say, I thought I was the only one. So if you have access to the internet, find other people like you. There are the people like you out there, whether it's through social media or whether it's Googling menopause groups or whatever. Chances are you will find a way to connect with someone going through at least something vaguely similar to what you're going through, to connect with. You may find other POI groups, and try and reach out, try and isolate yourself a little bit less if you can. And it is worth persevering on HRT if you have access to it and you can take it, because you don't realize how much better you can feel. And it's, you might not get it quite right the first time, but you will eventually, with perseverance, and you will feel better.
Yeah, definitely. And for all of those who are listening, you can find Naomi on Instagram at speak_POI. And I'm sure, Naomi, you'd be happy for people to reach out to you on a personal level as well.
And I'll also add that I've set up a Pakistan dedicated Facebook group, which is, as it says on the tin, premature ovarian insufficiency /failure Pakistan. And provided you identify as or live in Pakistan, just answer the group questions and I will very happily be welcome to that group. There is also for South Asians, whether they're living in South Asia or the diaspora, that is Daisy Network has set up. So I run that group, set it up on the Daisy Network, on Daisy Network's South Asia community, I think it's called.
And now will you be at Daisy Day?
I will be at Daisy Day and I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, so at Speak Up for POI is the Instagram handle. And please get in touch with me. No question is too silly. Don't feel alone. Reach out to all of us POIs. I hope this goes far and wide, and there is a way to get help for you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak to us. This has been an incredible episode. I'm sure you're going to reach so many women with all of your words and all of your support. So thank you. That's it for today. So we will thank you for joining us on the Premature Menocast. We'll be back soon with more episodes. We've got a few in the pipeline, so we're all very excited. But thank you for taking the time out, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Premature Menocast. We're really glad that you found us. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact us at prematuremenocast@gmail.com. And once again, thank you for listening.